Yesterday, I handed my wife divorce papers. Well, technically, I gave them to her mom to pass on, along with a message. Thank you for the time we spent together. My life has always carried a dark edge. I struggled to make friends, and when I did, they often betrayed me. I forgave them, but left scars. My experiences with women were particularly difficult. Not talking to them, but dating. Most of them friend-zoned me, and if I tried to move beyond that, I'd get responses like creep, loser, or worse. Maybe they weren't entirely wrong, but it hurt that they'd say these things in public or spread them around. It felt like humiliating me was entertainment for them. Before high school, my family moved from Ohio to Texas. It was hard. I had to leave my friends, flawed as they were, and start fresh. I managed to make a few new ones, but by the end, I lost them all too. I dropped out of high school, and ironically, an old crush from Ohio reached out, wanting to meet up. She even hinted at hooking up, which threw me off. It felt out of character, so I hesitated, but she insisted she was serious. I ended up going back. We spent time together, and then met up with some friends, including a girl who flirted with me all night. Nothing happened, but I felt a spark. We kept talking after I returned to Texas. That's when things started unraveling. Her mom had been monitoring her messages and found out that I dropped out of high school. She also learned I thought her mother was wrong for pressuring her into a military school just because her sister succeeded there. Her mom instantly disliked me and became an obstacle in our relationship. Eventually, I moved back to Ohio to live with my grandparents, and we finally got to spend time together. Everything was good, until we had to start hiding our relationship because her mom disapproved. I started sneaking into her house, which didn't feel too strange since it belonged to my friend's dad, and I'd been there as a kid. But then came prom, and she told me she couldn't go, only to show up with someone else. Pictures surfaced of her grinding with other guys. It was my first real love, so I exploded. I tried to forgive, but it haunted me, and she kept cheating. Eventually, she slept with someone else, including one of my friends who wouldn't admit it to my face. I spiraled out, eventually grabbing a gun from my grandparents and going to her place, planning to end things in front of her. That stunt landed me in jail with a protective order. When I got out, she reached out to me, and we tried again, but the cycle continued. I went to jail a couple more times, even caught some felonies. After 6 months inside, I came out different, numb. I messaged her, but she didn't respond. Life became lonely in that small town. Friends stopped talking to me, and strangers sometimes flipped me off on my long walks. Tinder was new, so I gave it a shot. Over the next year and a half, I went through about 36 brief relationships. Most of it felt empty. I was usually drunk, and on some occasions, I even fell asleep during. One girl I'd spent a fair amount of time with took it hard when I broke things off, thinking I was more serious than I was. It made me pause. I slowed down and became more honest about what I wanted, but I also just slowed down. And that's when I met the woman who would become my wife. That's where this story really starts. We've been together for 6 years now. When I first met her, she had experienced a seizure about a year earlier, although I didn't find out about it until later. She also misled me about her age, adding a couple of years, but she admitted it pretty early on, even before we met in person. She was kind, quiet, and reserved. During our first week together, I was still talking to a couple of other women. One I briefly dated, but she ended up embarrassing herself. The other was just someone I kept in touch with because she knew my ex. But my future wife stood out, and I realized I wanted her in my life. I even told my friends I felt differently about her, and soon after I proposed. I spoke with her parents, and they agreed, as long as she waited until she turned 18 and finished high school. That was fine, until I ran out of money. At the time, I was living with my aunt because my grandparents had asked me to leave after previous issues. But after I brought a few different women over to her place, my aunt eventually asked me to leave as well. So I went back to Texas to live with my family. I started getting impatient and wanted my fiancée to move in with me, which created some tension with her parents. Eventually, though, she graduated a year early and moved in with me. Our start was rocky. She left a few times saying she was done, and I'd end up begging her to come back, only for her to leave again. This cycle repeated 7 or 8 times. I'll admit I wasn't always good to her. I was distant and sometimes harsh. I even told her in our first month that I wasn't really physically attracted to her, though I cared about her. I thought it sounded honest, but of course, she took it hard. Looking back, I realized that I struggled to be vulnerable and open after my past experiences, afraid of losing control or getting hurt. In hindsight, I think my future self judges my past self too harshly. I loved her, I cared about her. I just didn't know how to show it properly. Right before she moved in, I took her to the Golden Lamb and proposed. While we waited for her to finish school, I experienced a major turning point. I found faith. That added a new layer of tension, since her views didn't align with my new beliefs. I was passionate, maybe a bit too rigid, trying to learn how to live according to my faith. A few weeks before our wedding, she left again, and I broke down, praying to God, wondering why all of this kept happening. She returned a few days later, but one night, I noticed her texting. When I asked who it was, she became noticeably anxious. I couldn't stay in the dark any longer. She refused to hand over her phone, and when I finally got it, she wouldn't give me the passcode. I got emotional, and when I finally unlocked it, I was hit hard by what I found. There were messages with multiple men. Each time she left, she'd invite someone over to her parents' place. She'd send them photos, even pictures of my dog, and intimate photos taken at our place. She'd recount events we did together as if they were with these men, and spoke negatively about me in messages with friends who encouraged her behavior. This had been going on for nearly a year without me knowing. I lost control. I yelled, called her every name I could think of, and then somehow managed to calm down. She apologized and promised not to leave again. But the next day, when I went to work, she left anyway. I felt numb, but we eventually talked. She wanted to come back, saying she needed to make things right and be with me. I was direct with my terms. No phone, no outside job, and I needed to know where she was at all times. She agreed without hesitation. About a week later, I made a mistake of my own. I met someone else, but it didn't feel right. I left, went home, and confessed everything. She forgave me instantly, and soon after, I found it in myself to forgive her as well. Finally, in 2021, we got married. Less than a year after our first child was born, we agreed to try for a baby. When our daughter arrived, we were overjoyed, but something changed when she would cry. Instead of patience, I felt a wave of anger I couldn't quite explain, rooted somehow in old, unresolved pain, not only from my wife, but from past relationships. My behavior turned aggressive, and within a couple of months, my wife confronted me about it. I begged her forgiveness, promising it wouldn't happen again, and though the aggression stopped, a rift remained. I withdrew, distancing myself emotionally from both my wife and daughter, losing myself in projects, like trying to create a board game, and on occasion logging onto Tinder. But these efforts led nowhere, and I ended up confessing everything to my wife, once even blurting out that marrying her felt like a mistake, and that my old life somehow held more glory. Things I didn't truly believe but said without knowing why. Then came disagreements. I wanted a second child, she didn't. I wanted us to dress more modestly. She disagreed. She wanted to paint her nails in bright colors, and I was opposed. She wanted to go on antidepressants, and I resisted. She wanted to move back to Ohio, while I wanted to stay. She hoped for us to get a place of our own, but financially, I wasn't able to manage that. Our arguments escalated from there. Eventually, she began refusing intimacy. Anytime we were together, it was only because I pleaded with her. I kept asking for a second child, and eventually she agreed reluctantly. She got pregnant, but it ended in an ectopic pregnancy. Later, I wanted to try again, but she refused. I threatened to leave over it, quickly retracting my words, but she left anyway. She did return, but things were different. When she came back, she grew more distant, rolling her eyes at me, leaving things messy, taking long walks alone at night. At bedtime, she'd often go to the media room and ask to be left alone. I continued working, ignoring the signs, maybe foolishly. One night, we played a board game, which she disliked, and our daughter grew upset. I suggested taking our daughter to her crib so we could finish, which led to an argument in front of my family. We went upstairs and she announced she was done. I lost my temper, raising my hand in frustration, then calmed down and asked why. She explained she couldn't handle another child or my ongoing aggressive behavior, then left. That first week, I got back on Tinder and almost met up with someone. But when she asked for a photo, she said I looked older than my profile picture. We didn't meet. Feeling defeated, I went back to my wife and suggested we see our pastor to lay out our issues. After talking with him, he recommended biblical marriage counseling. My wife agreed to try. The sessions continued for weeks, but she was distant. She spent most of her time with friends back in Ohio, barely talking to me, and lied about her plans, which I only found out through conversations with her mom. When I asked her about it, she became defensive, saying I was breathing down her neck. 4 weeks passed, the longest she'd ever been away. I started pleading with her to come back, both in counseling and over the phone, but nothing changed. After about 11 weeks, she finally agreed to visit but stayed in the guest room. On the way back, she stopped at a hotel 5 hours away, saying she wasn't feeling well the next day. I offered to help if she could just make it back, but she became irritated and hung up. When I couldn't reach her, I told her I was coming to get her. She eventually answered, insisting she'd come on her own. A few hours later, she called again, saying she had forgotten something and was turning around. I pleaded with her not to, but she stopped answering, and I couldn't track her location. The uncertainty of it all left me feeling anxious and helpless. Eventually, I get a call back from her. She's decided to head over rather than go back for what she'd forgotten, though it'll still be a few hours before she arrives. She's also in tears, saying how much she misses me. When she finally arrives, we have a few good days together. On the second night, I ask her to stay up with me, since I've missed her so much, but she insists she's tired and goes to bed. I go for a long walk, and as I return, I pass by the guest bedroom window and notice through the blinds that she's texting someone, not sleeping. I sit outside for about 20 minutes, then head upstairs to bed. The next morning is Sunday. I skip church, head downstairs to the guest bedroom, and find her in the bathroom, undressed and crying. Concerned, I ask her what's wrong, and she says she feels disgusted with her body. I try to reassure her, saying she's beautiful, and we cuddle, spending the day together. That night, she sleeps in the same bedroom with me. I decide to check her phone, hesitating because I don't want to keep snooping, but I finally do. I find a lot. She's been talking with another man for a long time, and there are intimate photos exchanged. I let her sleep, go for a walk, and call her mom, realizing from some of the messages that her mom knew something was happening. I confront her mom, then wake my wife, and we talk. It becomes heated, and she wants to leave, but I make some requests. Reluctantly, she agrees to stay. Later that night, feeling insecure, I asked for closeness, and we recorded as a way to create something private between us. In the early morning, I check her phone again and find more explicit videos of her with someone else, taken during her time at the hotel. She comes into the media room, offering to make breakfast, and I tell her I need some time alone. I call the man she's been seeing, and he tells me everything. They've been in contact since April, and they had met in Ohio. He asks if they can talk for closure, and I hesitantly agree. They speak, and she apologizes to him, saying she loves him. I'm overwhelmed with anger when their conversation ends, and she decides to leave again. I keep our child, but, feeling desperate, ask her to come pick her up, then make a self-harm attempt. I survive, the police come, and I end up spending a week in the mental health facility. After my release, my wife and I talk briefly, but she doesn't want to continue, and we agree to divorce. A day later, I send her a long video sharing my feelings and admitting my mistakes, and I feel a sudden conviction from God to change. I decide that no matter how much pain I feel, I'll continue to love her and fight for our marriage. A week later, she moves back to Texas with her family, which had been part of the plan for years. Surprisingly, we reconnect, go bowling together, share some drinks, and laugh. We spend the next few days together, finding a comfortable rhythm. This continues until midway through the next week, when I finally ask her about the other man. I'd noticed her being secretive with her phone, but tried to overlook it. I tell her I'm going to check, and I ask her to be honest if there's anything I should know. She admits that she's still talking to him. I stay calm, tell her I love her, but make it clear that I can't share her with someone else. She agrees to end things with the other guy but says she needs a day to process everything on her own. I insist on being there, but she's firm about doing it alone. The next day, I borrow her car to get to work because I had a flat tire. While driving, I find a Plan B pill in her car. We had unprotected intimacy a couple of nights before, and realizing this, I'm upset since I have strong feelings against Plan B. We argue. I end up leaving work so we can walk and talk, but she brings up wanting a divorce. Somehow, though, we patch things up the following day after spending Halloween together with our child and even fill out some divorce papers. Another week passes and I find a burner phone in her purse. She says it's from a previous situation and she'd forgotten about it. When I unlock it, I see it's logged into Instagram under a different account. She insists the account is deleted, but I can still see a profile. She claims it's an old account with no access to the password. We go for a drive, and I finally reach a breaking point, yelling in frustration. Despite everything, we make up, watch a movie at my place, and I decide to try logging into the account again. Eventually, I manage to get in, and when I look through her messages, I see she's been chatting and flirting with multiple guys for at least the past 2 weeks. This leads to another fight, and she leaves. 3 days go by, and she barely speaks to me. One night, I show up at her place, intoxicated, asking to talk. Her dad answers, and things escalate. He pushes, punches, and chokes me, but I hold back and keep asking to speak with her. She eventually comes out, hits me a couple of times, and leaves for her new job, leaving me hurt and frustrated. Determined to talk, I follow her to work, and afterward, she agrees to let me in her car. We go out for a meal and have a deep conversation. I break down, and for a moment, things feel hopeful again, and we decide to consult with our pastor. I head home, but the next day, she tells me she isn't ready to speak with the pastor yet and asks for more time. I agree, but the following day, I'm all over the place emotionally, going from hating her to begging her to stay, to thinking it's over, to wanting to hang out, and finally deciding on divorce. By the end of the day, I contact her mom to meet up and deliver the divorce papers. And here I am today, still waiting with no word from my wife. That's my life right now.